Hello and welcome back to Nest of Thearties. My name is Coll McCail and today is Sunday the 16th of August. This is the podcast which keeps you abreast of all of Scotland's political news and headlines, even at the height of silly season, and we are well and truly there. As ever, I'm delighted to be joined by Samuel Rafanell-Williams and Rory Hamilton. Rory, how are you?
Delighted to be back. I've been in soggy Outer Hebrides enjoying the delights of the Scottish summer. But nice to see you guys again. How are you both doing?
I am very well, surviving as ever. Sam, what about you? How's things?
I'm doing well. It's good to see you both. And in all seriousness, I have never been so glad for the Scottish summer. It is cold. It is raining in the south side of Glasgow, and it's glorious.
Yeah, I was on the train yesterday coming back from down south through dry field after dry field. I've never seen anything quite like it. I also got the wildfire alert while I was in Wales a fair few times, which was slightly dystopian. Yeah, strange times. Which is why podcasts like this are particularly important. And if you have a spare £5 going at the end of every month, you can support us financially on Patreon. That's not me leveraging wildfires and climate collapse to try and get your cash. But if you have any going, we'd love it. If not, you can support us by rating the podcast wherever you're listening, giving us a review, subscribing to our YouTube channel, or joining our mailing list and WhatsApp channel, the links to both of which are in the show notes. And I think without further ado, we'll move into this week's headlines. Rory, let's come to you first. What have you got for us?
Yeah, so for me, I'm coming to the report this week that Scotland's social housing programme has stalled, according to the Homeless Network Scotland. Which said that the country's house building programme is failing to keep pace with spiralling need, leaving around 250,000 people waiting for a home. This comes amidst the news that the Fraser Allender Institute also suggests the Scottish Government is on course to miss its pledge to deliver 110,000 affordable homes by 2032. Of course, we've covered the housing crisis pretty well on the podcast, and I think we're due to talk about it on Nest of Fearty soon as well. That in combination with the rent controls have been coming in, and the Scottish Government's drive to exempt non-affordable homes from the rent controls, I think is indicative of where the Scottish Government is at with house building, and what they aim to do with housing, particularly since the First Home Buyers Fund seems to just be acting as a bung to private developers.
Sam, what have you got for us this morning?
Yeah, I wanted to highlight a report in the Herald that was published either today or yesterday regarding the number of children in Scotland considered severely absent from school, which apparently has risen by 113.6% last year compared to 5 years ago, 2020, 2021. Being severely absent, I think, means that they miss more than half of the school year. In 2020, there were 6,414 children in this category in Scotland compared to 13,700 this past school year. Anne Gregg, who is an educational child psychologist, said that the issues causing severe school absences, including anxiety, bullying, specialist needs, or family problems, are often never addressed until they reach a crisis point, making it extremely difficult to help children return to education. And this trend does span the whole of Scotland. It seems it's not concentrated in specific areas, with severe absences over the past 5 years rising by 54% in Edinburgh, 126% in Glasgow, and 72% in the Highlands. So it seems like a real crisis, and something that needs urgently addressed, because the experts in that article are saying that we risk having a lost generation as a consequence.
Yeah, something we should probably pick up on Nest of Fearty some point soon. Do you remember the Scottish Government passed a Israel boycott in late 2025. Well, you'd be forgiven for forgetting when you read this headline. That's the news that Scottish Enterprise, the arm's length development agency of the Scottish Government, awarded £5.5 million to Israeli-linked arms firms in the year ending March 2026. A frankly staggering piece of news, were it not so unsurprising given how poorly implemented the Scottish Government's Israel boycott has been since last September. Listeners will recall a meeting that Scottish Government ministers took with Airbnb, who list hundreds of properties across the occupied West Bank following that BDS motion passing the Scottish Parliament last year. Anyway, here are the numbers on the amount of Scottish taxpayers' money which has been awarded to firms who make weapons or components of weapons which assist the IDF in perpetrating their genocide in Gaza. The list is as follows. Raytheon, one of the IDF's biggest suppliers, received £710,000 from Scottish Enterprise. Thales, who work closely with Elbit Systems on the development of drones, received £467,000 from Scottish Enterprise. BAE Systems, who make F-35 components, which have been used, as we know, to pound Gaza since October 2023, received 2 grants totaling £2.3 million from Scottish Enterprise. Leonardo, who make F-35 laser targeting systems, received £648,000. This all, as I say, was in the year which ended March 2026. These numbers totaled equate to roughly 2/3 of all funding given out by Scottish Enterprise to the aerospace and defence sector. So this is profoundly concerning, comes at a time when the SNP, as we have discussed regularly, is pivoting towards the embrace of militarism, campaigning for Keir Starmer in the latter days of his premiership to spend more on defence and more on weapons of war, and in this case, evidently allowing Israel-linked arms companies to receive Scottish Government cash in spite of the democratically expressed wishes of the Scottish Parliament. A really concerning story. Back to you, Rory.
Yeah, for me, mine's far more dull and boring. That this week, the GERS figures were released, the Government Expenditure and Revenue Scotland, which is essentially how it looks at the public sector revenue and the spending for the Scottish Government. It's often used by both the pro-independence side and the pro-union side to argue for each of their own agendas. The numbers really are they can do whatever you like for them. But this year, it was revealed in the year 2025 to 2026, £98 billion of public sector revenue was raised in Scotland, while £123.6 billion was spent for the benefit of people in Scotland, making a notional fiscal deficit of £25 billion, which is about 10%, 11% of GDP, compared with the UK's 4.2% of GDP. The long and short is the unionist side have really been touting that public expenditure in Scotland is £20,720 higher than the UK average. Like I say, the unionist side are touting this for the reason that it's a union dividend, that they're getting it from the redistribution from the Barnett formula, while the independentist side is arguing that this is the benefits of how the SNP manages to progressively redistribute policy, redistribute tax within Scotland. What I think, this hasn't learnt anything new particularly, other than the fact that we still are looking to see how the UK's increases to military spending will impact this in the future. I think it's still a little bit up in the air. For example, if the UK increases military spending to 5% of GDP, then this will mean spending an extra £81 billion per year on the military, and Scotland's share of this additional £80 billion is £6.5 billion, which in context is more than our entire transport budget and budget for environmental protections combined. So the real problem of relying on GERS is as an analysis of Scotland's finances is that it can't be used to speculate upon the finances of an independent state, and at the same time, it can't really be. It sort of underpins how the UK government doesn't actually detail how, like, defence spending, for example, can where is that going to be found? What are the particular nuances and details as to who that's going to get to? So yeah, Jers, as always, disappoints for everybody.
Yeah, it really does. I couldn't face discussing it in anything more than a brief headline, Rory. So thank you for taking the toll on that one. Sam, back to you for your final headline.
Yes, thanks for that, Jared's overview, Rory, which I think was very good and helps us all not have to engage with it very much further. I just want to go back, got a final headline, but just want to make a comment on Coll's headline. Just as a listener, as a viewer of this podcast, ask yourself, why does BAE Systems and Raytheon need subsidies from the Scottish government? Okay? the notion that 2/3 of the Scottish enterprise business investment budget from the Scottish government is in arms companies is completely bonkers.
2/3 of the arms budget, aerospace and defense budget, went to Israeli linked farms rather than
I see. Okay.
Overall budget. Yeah.
Okay. But my point stands. BAE Systems literally has contracts worth tens of billions of pounds from the UK government. The notion that the Scottish government needs to be subsidizing them as well is bonkers. But I've got a final headline about an industry that does need some help, probably from the Scottish government. And this relates to industry figures in Scotland's hydro sector, say that a landmark court decision determining business rate and property tax liability for Scotland's hydro operators threatens huge portions of the sector, in particular smaller operators, by ruling that water pressure pipes are taxable structures rather than tax-exempt equipment. The tribunal decision that passed recently cements high tax valuations and strangles reinvestment. That's what industry leaders are saying, and they also say that the hydro sector is trapped in a financial perfect storm, driven by colliding pressures. One of these is soaring local business rates. It's also the expiry of 20-year government green subsidies and energy markets within which operators can only sell their power at cheap flat rates, even during peak winter freezing spells. And there's an ongoing court battle over these property tax bills and how they affect an industry that operates around 500 small hydro schemes across the country.
Yeah, interesting stuff. Finally, for me, before we move on to our substantive stories, is a topic that we've been revisiting regularly in recent weeks. The Sunday Mail are reporting today that major new oil and gas drilling licenses could be granted by the UK government within weeks. They refer specifically to Rosebank and Jackdaw. Sources close to both projects have said the Prime Minister is, quote, increasingly convinced the projects will help combat the cost of living crisis and increase energy security. Of course, we know that as the country burns and as energy prices soar, the extent to which these new fields are going to help is minimal, but Andy Burnham seems convinced. Otherwise, the consultation regarding Rosebank closes tomorrow, and Donald Trump, of course, has urged Andy Burnham to open up the North Sea on Truth Social. So it looks like he is caving to that pressure, but we will see in the coming weeks. Let's move on to our first major story of the week, and that is the news that Police Scotland have issued a warning about the need for robust security measures to stop data centres from being attacked by protesters in Scotland. A great deal of opposition, that was the quote from Police Scotland, is likely regarding a proposed data centre in Larbert on Scotland's east coast. This is interesting because it's the first tacit acknowledgement by any kind of public institution in Scotland that the country's data centre boom is perhaps quite unpopular with those that live in Scotland, that it is the police having to be the first people to warn of it rather than the government themselves, I think says something. For context, this is an issue we've been returning to regularly, but there are 22 hyperscale data centres proposed across Scotland as we speak. If they are granted approval, they will use more than 1.5 times Scotland's peak power demand, and that's before we assess the impact on the wider environment, such as water usage. And as we've seen this summer, water is not something which is in as big of a supply as we might once have thought. So let's talk briefly, shall we, about this story and the police acknowledging data centres might be slightly unpopular with the public before the Scottish Government do. Rory, what did you make of it?
Yeah, I mean, if anything, I think it says quite a lot about the strength of feeling which people are having towards data centers, that the police are feeling some level of concern. I would say that it's interesting to mark the intensity with which people are rejecting this. And I think it really cuts across class issues in a lot of ways. And I think I would argue this is a real opportunity for the left to capitalize on this, whether that's within organized political parties or more specifically the climate movement and even the housing movement in some regards. Most particularly because I think the climate movement had its sort of peak around 2019, just before COVID, when I think it probably had greater public visibility and positive response among I think people were sort of saying, oh, look at all these young people who, want to see their future kept, right? And there was a broad swing towards renewables and this energy. And I think that there is a still broad public opinion, but I think media's opinion has really swung back. And in this occasion, this really presents itself as you rightly highlight, Coll, a number of environmentally related issues, particularly regards to water supply, regards to the electricity used to power it, etc. And the intense effects that will have on the local communities around it. Now, I think the fact that Police Scotland are concerned at the images which I've seen of most of these protests really do cut across generations, but we've also seen the police arrest older people for supporting Palestine action, among other things. So it's not unusual in that sense, but I think it does indicate something around a way to galvanize people towards a more democratic planning process is one part. Andy Burnham this week was already talking about the high street and making that more democratic, whilst at the same time pushing through this Brick Lane data center on the site of the historic Truman's Brewery, while local people in East London were decrying this and saying, we don't want this, and two, we need housing. We need affordable social housing, and that was a big pledge of Andy Burnham's as well, was to I think, what was it, the exact words he used? The biggest council housing building program we've seen since the end of the war, right? And one of the first opportunities he's had to do this is taking up pushing forward a data center, right? And if I think about this in the context of one of the headlines we talked about a couple of weeks ago around this sort of crash in the AI stock market and the bubble, I am increasingly feeling that the politicians who are pushing this agenda are really being led by trend, right? And not actually, in the same way that we talked about the lack of a grasp of the economics of oil and gas, politicians are failing to get into the depth of AI economics and are just hopping on board with what they think is the next big thing, the next thing that the economy has to be tied to. And in fact, are setting themselves up for failure. I think this is hugely unpopular. I would really recommend to people to go away and watch the film How to Blow Up a Pipeline. I think as a cultural piece, it's the sort of don't look up, but that actually engages with the questions about climate change that it needs to. But what I think the film does, and I haven't read the book, but it's based off of is it Andres Malm, how to build up a bike lane. What I think it does really well is highlight how even things like climate change aren't reserved to just sort of the wokey liberal middle class like students, and how actually working class people are affected by this as well, and how you can galvanize working class, perhaps white, sort of typically Republican, socially conservative people towards a progressive ends because of the way it infringes on certain ways that they feel about liberty, certain ways that they feel about their local area. And I think what's really important to note in the AI as the next sort of iteration of this, the AI data centers, is that it is affecting people's material interests where they're at. And that means their energy prices, their water consumption, the quality of the environment around them, noise pollution. The list is growing of concerns. And not only that, but also particularly when people feel, rightly or wrongly, and mostly wrongly, a certain way about asylum seekers and migrants in affordable housing, and seeing these data centers being built instead of other housing that needs to be built, there's an opportunity to flip that narrative around, okay, and take some quite regressive narratives around housing and asylum seekers and make that a progressive case in the context of what else could these the spaces that data centers are being built on be used for in a progressive to a progressive end.
Yeah, I agree, Sam. What did you make of the police's intervention?
Yeah, I'm going to build on a bit of what you and Rory have already said, but I think the notion that 22 hyperscale data centers using 1.5 times Scotland's peak power demand is not going to have an effect on energy prices, I think is fanciful for a start. And as you mentioned, Coll, there's also the water issue, and I want to reiterate, we mentioned this in a previous program, but while some data centers are promoted as having closed loop systems which recycle the water that they use to cool down their systems, and not all of them do, and require they have open loop systems and they require constant water supply. And that is, of course, why at a time in which most of England and all of Wales are in drought, and this will soon be an annual event, according to The Guardian, in that report in The Guardian, I quote, British officials have been pushing data center developers to build in Scotland, end quote. So the data center question in Scotland is very serious from an environmental and natural resource perspective, not least because, from my perspective, it's not clear what benefit these monstrosities have to society as a whole. It's not clear that they have a net positive benefit at all. And I've made this point again, and I'm going to reiterate again, it's not clear to me that AI large language models do have net benefit to our society, and the people spearheading this tech boom aren't even convinced of that themselves. And the people, and most importantly, ordinary people worried about their jobs, worried about AI hijacking kids' intellectual development, they are certainly also not convinced, right, about the net benefit of these technologies, this technology boom to our society. So I think that the anti-data center movement could end up becoming a huge cross-class movement in Scotland and maybe the wider UK, because it does raise all these vital questions about resource usage, land ownership, economic extraction that seem to be our perennial curse here in Scotland, in this country. And yeah, Police Scotland have caught on to the fact that there's a lot of anger about this. And I think that one thing that explains this anger, I think it's a big factor, is the enormous democratic deficit on this issue. The idea that data centers were literally not mentioned by any politician in the Scottish election, which took place this year, as part of Scotland's economic and technological prospectus going forward is crazy. I mean, it should have been a central issue on those television debates. And in fact, it's very conspicuous to me how little attention this issue has received in the media up until basically a few months ago. And communities in Scotland affected, right, by these projects will understandably feel conspired against. because of how silent politicians have been on this issue. And my final comment is on this. In a recent interview that Naomi Klein did, I think it was for Novara Media, she said that data center opposition in the US is single-handedly reviving the environmental movement, which she, like you said, Rory, she believes it's been at a very low ebb in the past few years post pandemic, but that opposition to data centers is reactivating a lot of those networks, and people, there are politicians now running political campaigns dedicated to opposing data center development. So if we infer that for better or worse, politics in the UK is very often downstream from the US, I can see this becoming a bigger and bigger issue. Coll.
I think you're spot on, Sam, and the democracy aspect was what I was going to raise. I think the central point here is the question that you raise, is who voted for these 22 hyperscale data centers to appear across the country? And the answer is nobody, because it was not an issue put before the electorate in May, and it hasn't been an issue ever put before the electorate. And I think when you balance that democratic deficit that you touched on with the interest behind the data centers themselves, you begin to get a clear picture. So you have a public which has not granted its consent to data center development across Scotland. And on the other hand, you have interests such as, friend of the podcast, the Easdale brothers. You have interests such as US big tech capital, and you have interests such as US asset managers, interests such as the Duke of Roxburgh and old feudal landowners, right? So you have this grisly coalition of the ruling class pioneering data center development across the country at the expense of natural resources upon which we all depend without the consent of the public. And that's the core issue. And is it any wonder then that the police have had to intervene to raise the amount of public anger which they expect to surface in the event that these applications go ahead? I think it's telling it's the police that makes this intervention and not the government. I think the Scottish government evidently do not know what to do regarding these data centers. We know how susceptible they are to lobbying. We know how susceptible they are to exactly the kinds of tight-suited people who will be appearing in Hollywood when it reconvenes later this year to tell them about the virtues of AI. We know how central AI may well become to the Scottish Government's public sector reform agenda. There's a whole lot of factors tied together here by the question of how the Scottish Government orientates on US tech, capital and AI, right, which is informing their attitude to these data centers, which is non-existent. By the way, they haven't even given a definition of what a green data center is, it's worth remembering. So a good conversation to have, but the crux of the question is, as ever, democracy and ownership. Let's move on to our second and probably our final story of the week, looking at the Time, and that is the news that John Swinney has finally picked up the issue of Ming Yang again. Regular listeners to this podcast will recall the decision by the UK government to block the development of the largest offshore wind turbine manufacturing factory anywhere in the British Isles off the coast of Scotland late last year. During the election campaign in April or March, I think. John Swinney has urged the new Prime Minister, Andy Burnham, to look at the issue, and he has been accused by the UK Energy Minister, Michael Shanks, of making a political intervention against the country's national security. That is the line that was deployed against John Swinney during the election when he attempted to raise it. To his credit, this is something that we had raised regularly during the campaign and said that this was an issue which the SNP should have made more of, given the promise of 1,500 jobs, given that the UK government had not raised objections to Chinese investment in other industries south of the border. And to his credit, John Swinney has now reactivated the issue, maybe not to the extent we would have liked or in the terms we might have favoured, but nonetheless it is making the news over the summer. Sam, what do you make of this headline?
So I'm obviously not privy to the intelligence assessment that compelled Keir Starmer's government to reject this wind turbine development. But I do think it's a bit rich for the UK government to greenlight their 5-acre Chinese embassy in central London while shutting down cash investment into the industry of the future in Scotland. And by the way, we know that embassies serve as spy hubs because that's how Western intelligence services use them too. And there's, as you mentioned, Coll, there's substantial Chinese investment in industries down south, and Hinkley nuclear power station, for instance. There's Chinese money all over our economy. They part own our bloody wind farms, for God's sake. Chinese investment is clearly not a red line in the UK, no pun intended. But also, as a reminder, the Mingyang factory would create almost 1,500 jobs with an investment of £1.5 billion. Okay, that's compared to just over 100 jobs created by that hyperscale data center in Fife, I think it was, which would have cost over £2 billion, right? So economically speaking, putting aside the intelligence services assessment, which we'll never know any details about, this is a genuine, real economic opportunity compared to data centers. And this one would have genuine net beneficial outputs for Scotland in terms of employment and in terms of workforce development in the medium term. From my perspective. So I do think it is worth revisiting by Swinney, but I also want to acknowledge, I think that he and the UK government as a whole are avoiding the larger issue of relying on external investment in order to support domestic industry, right? And our view here, I think, would be that the UK government itself should just be building these factories. If you can create 1,500 jobs in the renewables sector with £1.5 billion, then that's a pretty good investment. Imagine what you could do in terms of upgrading the grid, electrifying our economy, supporting thousands and thousands and thousands of jobs worth of employment with the £62 billion they're spending on nuclear weapons over the next 4 years, right? So I think this is worth revisiting from Swinney, and it's worthwhile for him to do it. But a topic that you bring up all the time, Coll, is our reliance and our deference for foreign direct investment in this country, even in industries which our government could be taking a lead on, supporting work in a more reliable fashion and cultivating skills and industrial capacity in the medium term domestically within our own country.
Yeah, absolutely. Rory, just looking at the clock briefly, what did you make of John Swinney's decision to re-up Mingyang during the summer months?
Well, I would say this and the data centers issue is really one. It captures the sort of UK government and SNP government's position of outsourcing responsibility. The whole foreign direct investment, it outsources the responsibility for the investment, for the creation of the jobs to somebody else. It's somebody else's problem to do that. And look, we're such good guardians at shoehorning this into our economy, and that's why we can steward that, right? In the same way that the data centers, we talk about them, and it's faceless AI people who are putting this forward, and this seems bizarre to me from a PR perspective at minimum, but like the Scottish government and the UK government both taking responsibility and blame for hammering down on this or not actually taking action either, right? Why would you do that when it's so unpopular? You're taking up the mantle of these people who are getting away with being faceless entities, and therefore the anger towards data centers is directed towards the Scottish government. Likewise, the anger towards the Scottish government over not introducing the benefits from things like the ScotWind supply chain, and then going on to talk about the how the windfall tax on oil and gas is destroying jobs, and how this from China, look at this great thing would come and solve this. It's like you outsource the responsibility for the creation of policy, for the investment in your own country, for new policy ideas, AI being bad or not. It's a new idea, seems at least something different, right? S&P haven't had one of those in God knows how many years. I think it speaks to the sort of vapidness and the sort of policy by press release approach that all governments have fallen into now off the back of years of spin. And that's sort of getting at the high level of it rather than getting into the details of the material of what it's actually going to mean. But that's what this is. It's an exercise in PR. It's John Swinney again walking down to Westminster and saying, "Please, sir, can I have some more?" and coming away yet again with nothing. It's like the annual service of Blackrod banging on the door, John Swinney going down to ask for a referendum, John Swinney going down to ask for some jobs in the energy sector. It's constantly walking us up the hill, and it's constantly coming back disappointed.
Yeah, I think you're broadly right. Although I'm going to give John Swinney his credit and say that while I think this is inherently limited, right? I do think if you were an SNP politician and you had an incoming prime minister who you weren't entirely sure how to navigate, who was talking about reindustrialization and pledging to invest where he could, this is probably the sort of thing that you would attempt to do. And I think in that sense, it makes a lot of sense. I do not think John Swinney has the charisma, politics, or nous necessarily to see it through, and it does come off, Rory, as you say, as rather cheap. But nonetheless, given it was a recommendation we made on this podcast during the election campaign, I'd feel bad if we just threw him under a bus for doing it, and I'll at least doff my cap to him attempting to stand up for Scotland when it comes to the development of offshore wind, even if it is foreign direct investment in a free port. And I think with that, we should finish today. We've been recording for 37 minutes. It's been a pleasure to have you both on the podcast as ever. If you've enjoyed listening to our ramblings, you can support us on Patreon for the price of an expensive coffee a month. You can subscribe on our YouTube channel, review us, or follow the account on Spotify as ever. Join that mailing list and WhatsApp channel. We'll be back next Monday with the latest news and headlines. See you soon.